Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to outline some arguments from Timothy Williamson in his book Modal Logic as Metaphysics. This is a technical, difficult book, but I'm going to try to introduce some of the basic ideas. So Williamson defends necessitism. Necessitism is the view that necessarily everything is necessarily something. So what the hell does that mean? Well, we usually take it that the world could have been different in many ways. So right now I am wearing a red shirt, but I could have worn a blue shirt instead. There's a possible sequence of events that leads to me wearing a blue shirt. Or the Allies could have lost World War II. There's a possible sequence of events that leads to the Allies losing World War II. Or there could have been talking donkeys, etc., etc. The world could have been different in all sorts of different ways. Now, similarly, we usually take it that the world could have contained different things. So one of the ways that the world could have been different is, different things could have existed. The things that actually exist might not have existed, and there might have been things that do not actually exist. If my parents had never met, I would never have existed. In those circumstances, I wouldn't have been anything at all. So there is something that could have been nothing, namely me. Conversely, consider Frank Zappa's fifth child. Frank Zappa never had a fifth child, but he could have done. So there could have been something that is actually nothing. So, there could have been fewer things in the world, or there could have been more things in the world. I do exist, but I might not have done. Frank Zappa's fifth child does not exist, but might have done. This is, I take it, the common sense view. Now, necessitists deny this. According to necessitism, it is necessary what there is. Necessarily everything there is, every object is necessarily something. So every object there is exists in every possible world. Necessarily, I could not have failed to exist. Now, I might have been different from what I am, but I must have existed. The computer that I am using to record this video must have existed. It could not have failed to exist. It could have been different from what it is, but it must have existed. This is necessitism. Contingentism, by contrast, is the view that there could have been different things. Now, contingentists need not claim that everything is contingent. They're going to claim that there is at least one contingent thing. There is at least one thing that might not have been anything. There is at least, there could have been something that is not currently anything, right? So that's the debate, right? Contingentism versus necessitism. Now, when we're talking about necessity here, these are claims about metaphysical necessity. It's necessity in the broadest sense. So some things are necessary in virtue of physical law. For instance, nothing can accelerate beyond the speed of light, at least assuming we're right about what physical laws govern the universe. But we might think that, even if the physical laws forbid anything from accelerating beyond the speed of light, the physical laws might have been different. There are possible worlds with different laws of physics where things can accelerate beyond the speed of light. So when necessitists claim that necessarily everything is necessarily something, they mean necessarily in the broadest sense, right? Like, even if we change the laws of physics, it would still be the case that everything is necessarily something. One way to put this is that even God could not make necessitism false. Okay, so necessitists say that basically everything is a necessary being. Whatever exists necessarily exists. Now, it's important to emphasize that necessitists do not deny that the world could have been different. So, yes, if history had played out differently, I might have worn a blue shirt rather than a red one. Or if history had played out differently, there might have been no humans. Of course, I am a human. So it follows that since I necessarily exist, and since there might have been no humans, I'm only contingently a human. In possible worlds where there are no humans, I still exist. I'm just not a human. That might sound a little bit odd. So, what the hell would I have been if not a human? Well, Williamson says I would have been a merely possible object. So let's consider this point a little bit more carefully. Take the coin in my pocket. Intuitively, we'd say, well, surely this coin might not have existed, right? I mean, maybe humans decide not to make coins. Even if the universe is deterministic, it's surely possible that there were different initial conditions such that the coin never came into existence. It's surely possible that no coins at all ever come into existence. Isn't that obvious? So what the necessitist would say is, well, we can grant that what kinds of things there are is contingent. So the coin might not have been a coin, but it would still have been something. What would it have been? It would have been something that could have been a coin. That is to say, it would have been a possible coin. So similarly, if history plays out so that there are no humans, right? Well, that might have happened. So I might not have been a human, but I would still have been something. What would I have been? I would have been something that could have been a human. I would have been a possible human. So the coin might have been a non-concrete, non-spatio-temporal possible object. If the universe had developed differently so that there were no coins, then this coin in my pocket would have been a merely possible object. Now, if you take, on the other hand, something that we would ordinarily say doesn't exist, like Frank Zappa's fifth child, well, in the actual world, Frank Zappa's fifth child is a merely possible object. If the universe had developed differently, Frank Zappa's fifth child would have been concrete. Either way, though, this object exists, right? The thing that we're denoting with the phrase Frank Zappa's fifth child, that exists. There is no way that things could have developed so that it fails to exist. It might have been concrete, it might have been merely possible, right? So there's a sort of sequence of events that leads to Frank Zappa having a fifth child. So Frank Zappa's fifth child becomes concrete. In the actual world, the sequence of events that took place means that Frank Zappa's fifth child is merely possible. But either way, this thing exists. It necessarily exists. So one way to think about what necessitism is claiming is to imagine a sort of domain of objects, some of which are concrete and some of which are merely possible. And then we can imagine playing the tape of history differently. Or we can imagine selecting different physical laws or whatever, and then we switch around which objects are concrete and which are not. So, here I have a sort of simple representation. Imagine there's like 4 possible worlds represented here, and the objects in blue are concrete, the objects in grey are merely possible. So, we can switch around the properties that these objects have, but there are the same objects in every possible world. So in the actual world, the coin is concrete. In a world where humanity never evolved and so never made any coins, the coin is merely possible. So objects have different properties, but the space of objects is fixed. None of these objects could have failed to exist, nor could there have been more objects than there are. That's what the necessitist claims. And of course, the contingentist, by contrast, will say, no, some objects exist, some objects don't exist. There are no merely possible objects. In the actual world, the coin exists, and if humans never made any coins, it would never have existed, and that's that. So, that's the idea. Now, there is a worry about this claim that there are non-concrete possible objects. So if we think about the coin again, well, if things had been different, we might not have produced any coins, in which case the coin wouldn't have been concrete. The necessitist says it would still have been something because it would have been a non-concrete possible coin. Now, Williamson points out, well, there's an objection along these lines, right? You might say, well, surely there couldn't be a non-concrete, merely possible coin, because in order for something to be a coin, it must be concrete. Arguably, concreteness is an essential property of coins. A coin is made of matter, some sort of metal, it's extended in space, but that's just to say that the coin is concrete. So this idea, this idea of these non-concrete possible objects just doesn't make any sense. Or at least it sort of violates very plausible claims. It's in conflict with very plausible claims about what the essential properties of certain things are. But Williamson says, look, we have to be quite cautious about what is meant by the phrase possible coin. So the objection in question is assuming a predicative reading of the phrase X is a possible coin. On this reading, so on a predicative reading of X is a possible coin, when we say X is a possible coin, this is equivalent to saying X is a coin and X could have been actual. It's equivalent to saying something like that. And so on this reading, all possible coins are themselves coins. When I say that if we had never made coins, then this coin would have been a possible coin, I'm saying that it would have been a coin that could have been actual, or that could have existed. In which case, if it's essential to a coin that a coin is a concrete object, all possible coins must be concrete. But clearly a merely possible thing could not be concrete, at least on many of the standard views about what possible things are. We are putting aside here views like David Lewis's modal realism. I have a video on modal realism if you are interested in learning about that view, but on Lewis's view, actually, merely possible things are concrete. But again, this is kind of beside the point. Most people don't get on board with that. So anyway, Williamson says, look, this predicative reading is just irrelevant, right? That's not what the necessitist is claiming. Instead, we have to, when we say X is a possible coin, we have to take the attributive reading of this. On the attributive reading, when I say X is a possible coin, that's equivalent to the phrase X could have been a coin. So when I say that if we had never made coins, then this coin would have been a possible coin, I'm just saying that it would have been something that could have been a coin. I'm not saying that it would have been a coin that could have been a coin. I'm just saying it would have been something that could have been a coin. So the necessitist can grant that being concrete is an essential property of coins, right? If the coin had not been concrete, it wouldn't have been a coin. Rather, it would have been something else. It would have been some other kind of thing that could have been a coin. If the coin had not been concrete, it would not have been a coin. It would have been a possible coin. Merely possible coins are not coins. So it's worth comparing the statement like, my friend Verity is a possible president. What's meant by this? Well, on the predicative reading, this would say that Verity is a president and Verity could have been actual, or Verity is a president and Verity could have existed. On the attributive reading, this says that Verity could be president. Verity could have been president. On the attributive reading, we're not predicating the property of presidenthood to Verity. On the attributive reading, merely possible presidents are not presidents. Possible presidents are people who could be president, that's all. And I mean, I think actually in most contexts, the attributive reading is probably the more natural for a statement like this, at least. Now, all of this still leaves us with the question, what the hell are these merely possible objects? Well, I mean, Williamson doesn't elaborate too much on this, but again, take the merely possible coin in my pocket, say, the merely possible coin in my pocket. Well, this has the modal property of possibly being a coin. I guess it has the modal property of possibly being a coin in my pocket. It has certain general logical properties, such as the property of being self-identical. It has perhaps relational properties, like it's the property of being referred to by the phrase, the merely possible coin in my pocket. But it doesn't have any other substantial properties. It's not made of metal, it doesn't have any particular size or shape, it's not located in space or time, though of course it has the modal properties of possibly being made of metal, possibly having a particular size and shape, possibly being located in space and time. Now this view of course does have some odd consequences. I mean, we might say, well, okay, these merely possible coins, I mean, there is the merely possible coin in my pocket that's 2 centimeters in diameter, and the merely possible coin in my pocket that's 2.5 centimeters in diameter. Are these different merely possible coins? What about the merely possible coin in my pocket where I just leave its exact size unspecified? Is that a different merely possible coin again? Like, is there a merely possible coin that's of indeterminate size? Worries like these have led some philosophers to be suspicious of the very idea of merely possible objects. We won't get into that here, but yeah, maybe in another video. You know, people like Quine have raised concerns about possibilia on these sorts of grounds in his article on What There Is. But so yes, I mean, this is a view that has you know, perhaps some strange consequences insofar as it is committing to the existence of possibilia like this. Okay, then, a quick advert. I take it that if you're not a Patreon subscriber, then you are a possible Patreon subscriber. This doesn't mean that you are a Patreon subscriber and that you could have been actual. It means that you could be a Patreon subscriber. And my Patreon subscribers have access to bonus videos. So it's a rather nice thing to be a Patreon subscriber. So it's worth thinking about, right? There is bonus content available on my Patreon if you want to see more of me. And if you want to support the channel, I would really appreciate it, obviously. You know, look, these videos, they take a lot of work, so anything you can throw my way to help pay the bills is really appreciated. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy, and I've done a degree, a master's, and a PhD in philosophy, so I'm reasonably well qualified. I have a Discord, which you can check out if you want to talk to other people about this stuff. So that's the advert. Let's get back to Necessitism. Well, hopefully this has clarified what Necessitism is claiming. Now, I mean, initially I sort of said that contingentism is sort of kind of seems like the more common sense position, right? It's maybe the more intuitive view. For many philosophers, this is going to be quite an important point because many philosophers take it that it is a cost of a theory if it you know violates our intuitions, or certainly if it says anything that's obviously false. And to claim that, I mean, certainly like when we initially state necessitism and we say, well, every object is a necessary being, right? Like I am a necessary being, the computer in front of me is a necessary being. I could not have failed to exist. The computer could not have failed to exist. That sounds very odd. And so that might be seen as being something of a drawback of this theory. But Williamson says, well, it's not so clear that necessitism is actually counterintuitive once we specify what it's actually saying. So, again, take the coin, right? Ordinarily, we say the coin could have failed to exist. There just might not have been anything. You know, there is this coin, and but there could have just been nothing. But, you know, necessitists are going to agree with at least one way of framing this, which is to say, well, there might have been no coin. There might not have been anything that instantiates the kind coin. Rather, this thing, this particular coin, might not have been a coin. It would still have been something. It would have been a merely possible coin, a non-concrete object. Now, this is a technical claim. It's a very technical claim within metaphysics, and this isn't something that common sense says anything about one way or the other. Again, the necessitist is not denying that things could have been different. The necessitist isn't denying that history could have played out such that nobody ever made any coins. The debate between the necessitist and the contingentist is whether there are these merely possible objects. That's what the debate is really about, and common sense, at least according to Williamson, doesn't say anything about that. So when I take this coin, right, so ordinarily we say, well, this coin could have failed to exist. And if we interpret that as saying that there could have been no coin, then actually that's totally compatible with necessitism. Yeah, there could have been no coins. There could have just, you know, but in the possible world in which there are no coins, then this coin would have just been a merely possible coin. And is that so, I mean, is that so counterintuitive to say that, you know, in the world in which this coin, in which there are no coins, right, that this coin would have been a merely possible coin? Well, maybe that's not such a outrageous claim. Similarly, the necessitist says that there is an object that could have been Frank Zappa's fifth child, and namely Frank Zappa's possible fifth child. Now, this object is not part of the contents of space and time, so of course we don't find it when we examine the concrete objects located in space and time. This does not mean that there is something that is a child who is not spatiotemporal. Again, it would be very, well, arguably it probably would, violate common sense to say that there are non-spatiotemporal, non-concrete children. But that's not what's being claimed here. What's being claimed is that there is something that could have been a child. And if it had actually been a child, then it would have been spatiotemporal, but actually it's a merely possible child, and a merely possible child isn't a child. Again, is it just obvious that there is no such thing? I mean, bear in mind that we already have independent arguments for non-concrete things. For instance, in philosophy of mathematics, Platonists will give arguments for the existence of abstract mathematical objects. And it's hard to see how common sense bears on these debates one way or the other. So Williamson says that appeals to common sense are irrelevant here. All we can do is assess our best metaphysical theories in accordance with virtues like coherence and simplicity and explanatory power and so on. And Williamson will argue that necessitism comes out on top here. Now, of course, as Williamson notes, I mean, necessitists are committed to, let's say, an inflationary ontology relative to contingentists, because there are infinitely many possibly concrete things. You have Frank Zappa's fifth child, you've also got Frank Zappa's sixth child, and Frank Zappa's possible fifth child, his possible sixth child, his possible seventh child, and then there's all the possible children of every other human being, and all the possible children of those possible children, and so on. And that's only the possible objects concerning biological reproduction, never mind all the other possible objects. So like there are countless possible things, countless possible objects. Now, keep in mind though that this ontology it's not inflationary with respect to concrete objects, with respect to the things in space and time. It just postulates this realm of possible objects, and I mean, it's not obvious that it matters so much whether there are, that there are infinitely many possible objects. Why should we expect the repository of possible objects to be small or simple? I mean, even so, I mean, obviously there is a kind of ontological commitment here, right? And you might take that to be a cost of necessitism. But the important point is that this doesn't seem to be a matter of violating common sense or anything. It's not obviously false. The problem is that there is this, okay, we have a sort of general theoretical virtue of simplicity. If two theories score equally well with respect to other theoretical virtues, we tend to prefer the theory that does not involve postulating some whole new realm of objects. But if we're, I mean, there can be motivations for postulating realms of objects, and Williamson thinks that necessitism is well motivated. So, okay, well, hopefully that clarifies what necessitism is, and maybe answers some of the immediate objections to necessitism. But why believe it? I mean, why should we take this seriously? Well, I'm not going to look at all the arguments Williamson gives. As I said, it's a long and difficult book, and I haven't read the whole thing, and even if I did, I don't think I would understand it all. So we won't go through everything, but there is a basic argument that revolves around a formula in modal logic known as the Barcan formula. And this formula tells us how modal operators and quantifiers interact. So here's the formula in its most general form. You can substitute any individual variable for V and any open or closed formula for A. So the simplest form of this is if it is possible that there exists an X such that X is F, then there exists an X such that X is possibly F. In other words, if there could have been an individual that satisfies condition F, then there is an individual that could have satisfied condition F. So that is the Barcan formula. Now, contingentists reject the Barcan formula. According to contingentists, there could have been more things than there actually are. So there could have been something that is actually nothing. So x does not actually exist, but it could have. The contingentist, so the contingentist is going to affirm the following formula, right? Like that like possibly there exists an x such that actually there does not exist a y such that x equals y. This is just to say that it's possible that there is something that actually does not exist. There could have been something that there isn't. The contingentist will affirm that. But now we can plug that into the Barcan formula, in which case we get the following conditional claim. The consequent here says that there is an x such that possibly there actually does not exist a y such that x equals y, such that x is y. To put it in plainer language, there is something that could have been actually nothing. But that doesn't make any sense. Something that there actually is could have been nothing, sure, that makes sense. But its being nothing could only be counterfactual, because by hypothesis it's not actually nothing. It couldn't have actually been nothing because it couldn't have been nothing in the actual world, right? Like if I have a coin, then perhaps it makes sense to say that there is a world at which it is nothing, right? There is a world at which this coin doesn't exist, this object doesn't exist. But this could only be some other possible world, right? If I actually have a coin, then it can't be nothing in the actual world. So we're going to say that the consequent here is false, right? So the contingentist is affirming the antecedent, but they certainly don't want to affirm the consequent. So, we have a true antecedent, false consequent. We have a counterexample to the Barcan formula. Williamson makes this point in a simpler way. This is a little bit complex, I know, but so here's a simpler way to put this. Suppose we take f here to mean is such that it is actually nothing. Okay, and so then we have just the simple formula, right? Possibly there is an x such that x is f, right? So possibly there is something that is such that it is actually nothing. The contingentist is going to affirm this. Possibly there is an x such that x is actually nothing. There could have been something that actually doesn't exist. Fair enough. But then if we apply the Barcan formula, we get this claim, where the consequent here says that there is an x such that it is possible that x is such that it is actually nothing. But if there is an x, if there actually is an x, then x can't actually be nothing. It can only counterfactually be nothing. It can only be nothing in a different world, not the actual world. Okay, so if there is an x, then it wouldn't make sense to say, well, it's therefore possible that it is that in the actual world it's nothing. No, in some possible world maybe it's nothing. Fair enough, but it can't be nothing in the actual world. Again, this is all a bit abstract, so let's take a more specific example. Suppose we read F to mean is the fifth child of Frank Zappa. Okay, then the antecedent here says that possibly there is an X such that X is the fifth child of Frank Zappa. According to the contingentist, that's true. Frank Zappa could have had a fifth child. So, okay, Frank Zappa's fifth child doesn't actually exist, but could have existed. But then the consequent says that there is an X such that X is possibly the fifth child of Frank Zappa. That is, there is something that's not Frank Zappa's fifth child, but could have been Frank Zappa's fifth child. But what on earth could this refer to on the contingentist view? I mean, the contingentist is obviously going to deny that there is any such thing, right? There doesn't so there's not actually existing something, some object that could have been Frank Zappa's fifth child. If Frank Zappa had had a fifth child, the world would have contained more things than it actually does. So no, right? The consequent here says there is this thing, such that this thing possibly is possibly Frank Zappa's fifth child. Well, no, not according to the contingentist. There is no such thing. So again, we have a true antecedent, a false consequent. So these are cases where so this kind of case would be a counterexample to the Barcan formula as the contingentist sees it. Now, we can take the converse of the Barcan formula. So this is the converse Barcan formula. Basically, this is going to say that if there is something that could have satisfied some condition, then there could have been something that satisfied the condition. Again, the simplest form of this will say, if there is an x such that x is possibly f, then possibly there is an x such that x is f. If there is an individual that could have satisfied condition f, then there could have been an individual that satisfies condition f. Okay, so contingentists are going to reject this. Suppose we read f to mean is nothing, then according to the contingentist, the antecedent is going to be true, right? So the antecedent here says, right, there is an x such that possibly x is nothing. So take the coin in my pocket. This coin could have been nothing. There is a coin, and this coin might not have been. But the consequent here then is clearly false. The consequent would end up saying that it's possible that there is a coin such that the coin is nothing. There could have been a coin that is nothing. So this is saying, like, at some possible world, right, there's a coin and the coin is nothing, right? Possibly there is an x such that x is nothing. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. And this is basically saying that at some possible world, something is nothing. Well, no, there is no possible world at which something is nothing. It's not possible for something to be nothing. There is no possible world at which a coin is nothing. So the contingentist would, again, we have here a true antecedent, false consequent. The slightly more technical way to state this is as follows. So the antecedent here says there is an x such that possibly there is no y such that x is y. There is something that could have been nothing. Again, according to contingentist, this is going to be made true by the coin in my pocket. The coin might not have existed. The consequent says possibly there is an x and there is no y such that x is y. Possibly something is nothing. But to say that something is nothing is, it's not possible, right? That's just inconsistent. So contingentists will say we have a true antecedent and a false consequent, and hence a counterexample to the converse Barcan formula. So basically, everybody here is going to agree that the consequent is false. So, there are two options, right? We can affirm with the contingentist, so we can, with the contingentist, affirm that the antecedent is true, and hence this is a counterexample to the converse Barcan formula. It's an instance of the converse Barcan formula with a true antecedent and a false consequent. Or we can keep the converse Barcan formula and apply modus tollens to deny the antecedent. So we keep the converse Barcan formula, and then with this formula we say, well, that consequent is false, so the antecedent is false. So it is not the case that there is something that could have been nothing. And that's going to be equivalent to the following formula, which says that for all x, necessarily there is a y such that x is y. Or in other words, everything is necessarily something, which is what the necessitist affirms. So the necessitist can maintain the Barcan formula, the contingentist cannot. Alright, the contingentist needs to reject the Barcan formula, but the Barcan formula is part of the simplest, strongest system of modal logic, according to Williamson. So, this is already a cost of contingentism. And the contingentist is going to need to identify where exactly the proof of the Barcan formula goes wrong. Now, Williamson says that the sort of most plausible route for the contingentist to take is to deny the following formula. Okay, we have necessarily, and then the antecedent says that there is no y such that x is y. The consequent says there is an x such that there is no y such that x is y. Now, take the coin in my pocket. Suppose that the coin had not existed. Then in some possible world, the coin satisfies the antecedent. But still, there would not have been something that was nothing. There would not have been some object identical to the coin in the world where the coin does not exist. Everybody accepts that the consequent here is inconsistent. So contingentists are going to have to reject this. But now we have a problem, because this formula is just... So this formula that the contingentist is rejecting is just the necessitation of this formula here. And this is a theorem of standard first order classical logic. So we can prove this in standard first order classical logic. It's just an instance of existential generalization. From A is P, you infer there is an X such that Px. This leaves the contingentist with two options. First, the contingentist can reject standard first order classical logic. If they take this option, they're going to be forced to use a free logic. So basically the difference is this. In classical logic, each singular term denotes an object. In free logic, this is not so. Let's say that I affirm that Frank is a philosopher. In classical logic, I can then derive that there exists something that is a philosopher. That's existential generalization. This principle fails in free logics because the term Frank need not be taken as denoting anything, so we can ascribe properties to Frank without inferring that Frank exists. So the name free logic comes from the idea that it is a logic free of existence assumptions. There are independent reasons to adopt free logic. I discuss one of them in my recent video on non-existent objects, but free logic is in various ways more complex than classical logic, and many people deny that these independent reasons to adopt free logic are compelling. So, one option, replace classical logic with free logic. The second option is to accept standard first order classical logic, so we accept this formula, but then we deny the necessitation of the formula. Where necessitation is the rule that if P is a theorem, then necessarily P is a theorem. So if you can prove that P, if you can prove some like logical law, some theorem that P, if you can prove that within the system, then the necessitation rule allows us to infer necessarily P. This is basically just to say that every logical law is necessary. And necessitation is a rule of all standard modal logics. If the contingentist takes this option, then she's going to have to deny that logical laws are necessary, and she's going to have to adopt some, non-standard modal logic, right? So the conclusion is, as Williamson puts it, in practice, therefore, non-modal classical logic and necessitation force necessitism. Thus, contingentists must choose, either adopt free logic, even for the non-modal fragment of their language, or restrict necessitation. Neither of these options is attractive. They require significant revisions to our logic. That, in brief, is the basic structure of at least one of Williamson's arguments. So what I've tried to do here is give a brief outline of the arguments in the first two chapters of Williamson's book. Hopefully that gives you a flavour of Williamson's project. I mean, the general idea here is necessitism follows from the simplest and strongest modal logic, and our metaphysical commitments ought to be guided by logical theory. So, I mean, there's a kind of inference to the best explanation going on here, right? We ought to accept whichever logical theory scores the best in terms of simplicity, strength, elegance, explanatory power, and so on. The theory must fit with what we know, so it can't entail anything that can independently be shown to be false. At the same time, we shouldn't be putting too much weight on like common sense intuitions. There's no particular reason why intuition would be a guide to the facts about modal metaphysics. But in any case, I guess the way to sort of frame this is that there's a standard assumption among many analytic philosophers that logic makes no claims about how the world is. Logic is entirely topic neutral. It tells us about patterns of truth preservation, about how to make inferences, so we can make certain conditional claims. So what we can use logic to sort of figure out what follows from what by saying like, well, if you accept this, then you're going to be committed to this. If you accept these things are true, then you're going to be committed to saying that these things are true. But logic in itself can't tell us anything about what is true and what is false. So logic can't dictate metaphysics. Logic can't tell us what the world is like. And Williamson is trying to show that this is mistaken. Modal logic really does tell us the truths about metaphysical necessity and possibility. We can't maintain a clean line between modal logic and metaphysics. And the reason for this is that different metaphysical systems commit us to different logics. So these different logics, form the sort of core part of different metaphysical theories. But then those different logics can themselves be assessed for their simplicity and strength. They can be assessed in accordance with the same sorts of theoretical virtues that we use to assess metaphysical theories. So a necessitist can affirm non-modal classical logic and necessitation. The contingentist can't. The contingentist needs to either adopt a free logic or to reject necessitation. If you reject necessitation, then you've got to either just junk modal logic entirely or adopt some sort of deviant modal logic. But the point is like we can now start to assess which of these logical systems scores the best in terms of the theoretical virtues, right? We now have very well developed formal systems of modal logic, and surely the sorts of systems that are the simplest and the strongest are those that include necessitation. So when we're trying to determine which is the correct logic, much of our task is going to involve, as Williamson says, the search for universal laws to order, unify, and generalize what we already know. So we choose the simplest and strongest logic that does not contain obviously false theorems. Necessitism is a surprising consequence, but it isn't obviously false, and we should accept the surprising consequences that our best theories have, right? If a simple and strong and elegant and powerful theory has a surprising consequence, that's a good reason to accept the surprising consequence. So we have good reason to accept necessitism on the grounds that the simplest, strongest, most powerful logical theories entail it. And that's necessitism, and that's the end of that video. Thanks for watching.